seemed to carry weight, where glances were measured, and reputations were quietly judged without a single sound. She was there, not because she had the same kind of wealth or influence as the others, but because she had earned a place through her work, her persistence, and her quiet refusal to be overlooked. Yet, despite that, the moment she walked in, she felt the sting of being underestimated. The billionaire's sister, with her polished smile and unshakable confidence, looked her over and dismissed her in front of an audience. The word useless was tossed out like it was harmless, but it wasn't harmless at all. It was a strike meant to cut deep, to remind her of where she supposedly stood in the unspoken hierarchy. For a brief second, her chest tightened, and she could feel the warmth of embarrassment rise to her face. Around her, some people averted their eyes, while others let a smirk slip, the kind of reaction that silently agrees with the insult but doesn't want to be caught doing so. She didn't respond right away. She knew that answering in that moment, with emotion in her voice, would only feed the picture they had already painted of her. Instead, she chose stillness. It was not the stillness of defeat, but the stillness of a mind already working out the next move. The humiliation lingered, but it didn't crush her. In fact, it did something far more dangerous to her critics. It lit a fire. The words replayed in her mind not as a wound, but as a challenge. Being publicly insulted by someone so sure of their own power didn't just hurt, it clarified something. It reminded her that in this world, people could build an entire image of you based on stereotypes, assumptions, and the surface-level details they think they see. The billionaire's sister had decided she was insignificant before ever learning a single real thing about her. That was the true spark, the realization that the way people saw her had nothing to do with her actual worth, and that the only way to shift that narrative was through undeniable action. She thought about how humiliation works. It's designed to shrink you, to make you retreat so you never try again. But it can also serve as a blueprint for your next victory if you know how to read it. Every cutting remark reveals what someone values, what they fear, and where they're vulnerable. In this case, the insult wasn't just random, it came from a place of arrogance, from the belief that money and connections were the only things that mattered. That belief, she realized, was both the billionaire sister's shield and her weakness. Instead of letting the words press her down, she let them settle into the back of her mind like fuel. She replayed the moment deliberately, not to wallow in it, but to sharpen her memory of how it felt. She wanted to remember the exact tone, the exact curl of the lip, the way the air in the room seemed to turn heavy after the insult landed. She understood that emotions, when used carefully, can be transformed into power. And that kind of transformation starts in the quiet after humiliation, when the world thinks you've been silenced, but you're actually recalculating. What the billionaire's sister didn't see was the shift happening behind her calm expression. On the outside, she gave no sign of how much the words mattered. On the inside, she was already stacking reasons, building an unshakable list of motivations that would carry her far beyond that moment. Public humiliation didn't strip her of dignity, it gave her the purest form of determination, the kind that doesn't come from inspiration but from the refusal to let someone else's narrative define your life. She realized that some victories aren't born out of comfort or encouragement. They're forged in the exact instant someone dares to write you off. That moment becomes a reference point, something to look back on, not with shame, but with a clear understanding of where the turning point began. And when the turning point is public, so is the motivation to make the transformation just as public. The billionaire's sister thought she had embarrassed her, but all she had really done was put the first stone in the foundation of something much larger than she could imagine. This was not about revenge, at least not in the shallow sense. It was about reclaiming the space that humiliation tries to take away from you. It was about showing that even when someone speaks to diminish you, they cannot control the actions you take next. The insult had planted itself in her mind, but instead of taking root in bitterness, it took root in strategy. Every goal she began to set, every choice she began to make, was sharpened by the clarity of that public moment. She understood something else, too: humiliation in front of others creates witnesses. Those who saw her being dismissed would one day see her rise, and that contrast would tell a story louder than any argument she could have made that day. So she carried the moment with her, not as baggage, but as a quiet, constant reminder that the greatest transformations often begin in the most unlikely circumstances, and that the spark for determination can come from the very people who think you have none. Patience was not about doing nothing, it was about doing the right things at the right time. After the sting of being dismissed so casually, the instinct to act immediately was strong, almost overwhelming. There was a temptation to confront the insult head-on, to make a statement right there in the room, to prove to everyone watching that she would not be silenced or underestimated. But she understood that reacting in the heat of the moment might satisfy her pride for a few seconds, yet it could also sabotage something much bigger. She knew she was playing a longer game, and in a long game, timing was everything. The restraint she showed wasn't weakness, it was a form of strength most people never learn to master. She kept her composure, letting her opponent believe she had accepted the humiliation without a fight. In reality, she was buying herself time, letting the billionaire's sister remain comfortably unaware that she was, in fact, being studied. Every careless word, every public display of arrogance, every business move was being quietly observed and filed away. This was the essence of strategic patience, learning everything you could before making a move so that when you finally did, it would be devastatingly precise. Patience gave her something that anger could not, clarity. Instead of drowning in the emotional rush that humiliation brought, she allowed herself to watch and listen, to notice patterns in behavior, to pick up on small inconsistencies in the way the billionaire's sister handled her ventures. She didn't speak about her plans, didn't drop hints to anyone, and didn't allow herself to be rushed into proving her worth prematurely. She understood that power, real power, wasn't in the quick clapback, it was in the undeniable results that came after careful preparation. The waiting was not idle. Every day, she built her resources quietly. She strengthened her own position, expanded her network, and studied the very industry the billionaire's sister thought she owned. She read contracts in detail, learned market movements, and tracked competitors. She paid attention to the cracks in the empire the sister had built, cracks most people ignored because they were blinded by the gloss of wealth and influence. Strategic patience wasn't about sitting still, it was about moving quietly in the background, so when the time came to step forward, the ground was already prepared for victory. She also understood human nature well enough to know that people reveal more when they don't see you as a threat. By not reacting publicly, she became almost invisible to the billionaire's sister. That invisibility became an advantage. Invitations to industry events kept coming, conversations stayed open, and opportunities to see behind the curtain multiplied. People around her began to speak more freely, dropping valuable pieces of information without realizing they were doing it. What they saw as passivity was in truth a slow, deliberate gathering of the exact tools she would need. Patience allowed her to refine her plan. Instead of rushing into a deal or jumping into competition too soon, she tested ideas in smaller ways, learning what worked and what didn't. She used her time to secure funding quietly, to find the right partners, and to put together a team that could execute at a level that would make her not just competitive, but impossible to ignore. She resisted the urge to announce anything prematurely, because she understood that surprises hold more power when they are revealed fully formed, without warning. The billionaire's sister, meanwhile, carried on as if nothing had changed, still certain of her superiority, still confident that her words had left no mark. She didn't realize that her very dismissal had given her opponent a roadmap to the perfect moment to strike. That confidence made her careless, and carelessness was a gift to someone who knew how to wait. Every arrogant display became another confirmation that the timing for a move was not yet ripe. Patience, in this way, was not just about avoiding mistakes, it was about letting your opponent create their own. In those months of waiting, she learned to find satisfaction not in the instant gratification of proving someone wrong, but in the slow build of a plan that would speak for itself. It was in the quiet moments of planning, the long nights of research, the unglamorous work of building something that could last. There was no rush, no frantic push to prove herself in someone else's time frame. She was operating on her own clock, one that ticked steadily toward a moment when her actions would need no explanation. The discipline of patience also built her resilience. She was not chasing temporary wins, she was creating something with enough strength to endure. She didn't have the luxury of throwing resources away on half-formed ideas or impulsive moves, so she made sure every step forward was intentional. Waiting became its own kind of preparation, one that allowed her to see the whole board, not just the piece she was moving in the moment. She knew the danger of acting too soon. She had seen others crumble because they moved before they were ready, driven more by emotion than by strategy. She refused to let that be her story. The insult she had endured had planted a seed, and seeds don't grow overnight. They need time, the right conditions, and careful tending before they can break through the surface. She was willing to give it all the time it needed, because she understood that when it finally emerged, it would do so with strength and certainty that could not be shaken by a single insult or a passing moment of arrogance. Spotting opportunity in someone else's weakness was not about waiting for them to fail, it was about watching closely enough to see the cracks before anyone else noticed. After the public humiliation, she began paying attention to the billionaire's sister with a sharper focus, not just as a person but as a leader, an investor, and a business owner. She studied her decisions, her behavior in meetings, and the way she interacted with people she considered beneath her. It became clear that arrogance was not just part of her personality, it was a blind spot. She underestimated people so completely that she often dismissed real threats until it was too late. That kind of thinking might work in a closed circle where everyone plays by the same rules, but in the real world, it was a liability. The weakness wasn't just in her arrogance, it was also in her priorities. The billionaire's sister had built her ventures with more emphasis on image than on sustainability. She poured resources into things that looked impressive from the outside but didn't create long-term stability. She launched projects without proper market research, confident that her name and influence would be enough to make them succeed. This meant there were gaps, unprofitable divisions, underdeveloped ideas, and teams that lacked the direction they needed to thrive. It was a classic case of mistaking money for strategy, and for someone who knew how to identify those gaps, it was an open door. Observing from the background gave her the freedom to connect dots without interference. She noticed small details others ignored, delayed product launches, staff turnover that was quietly brushed aside, partnerships that dissolved without public explanation. Each of these was a clue, a sign that despite the glittering image, things were not as unshakable as they seemed. She didn't need to invent an opportunity, it was already there, hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone bold enough to claim it. The billionaire's sister also had a tendency to overextend herself. Because she was used to winning easily, she didn't take the time to truly understand new markets before entering them. When she saw a trend, she rushed to capitalize on it, throwing money and resources at it without fully grasping the customer base or competition. This left several of her ventures vulnerable, especially the smaller ones that didn't have the same safety net as her flagship projects. Those smaller ventures often carried the seeds of something valuable, but they were being mismanaged, left to struggle without the right leadership. That was where the real opportunity lived. She knew that taking advantage of this weakness required more than just seeing it, it required the ability to step in at the right moment. If she moved too early, the billionaire's sister could correct the mistake. If she moved too late, someone else might notice the same opportunity. Timing was critical, and so was discretion. She kept her observations private, never discussing them openly, even with people she trusted. The less anyone suspected her intentions, the smoother her path would be when she was ready to act. The deeper she looked, the more she saw a pattern. The billionaire's sister valued visibility over strength, chasing public attention rather than building foundations that could weather difficult times. She relied on her name to open doors, but those doors often led into rooms she didn't know how to navigate. This was the kind of weakness that couldn't be fixed overnight, because it wasn't about a single bad decision, it was about the mindset driving every decision. And mindsets are hard to change, especially when the person doesn't believe they need to. Opportunity also came in the form of relationships. People who had worked with the billionaire's sister and felt undervalued or ignored became potential allies. She never approached them directly at first. Instead, she listened when they spoke, picked up on their frustrations, and remembered the details. Over time, this quiet understanding of the human side of the business gave her an advantage no balance sheet could provide. She could see who might be willing to leave, who might be open to a better offer, and who might even be willing to share insights if they felt respected and heard. She didn't see herself as preying on weakness. She saw it as recognizing what was already there and being prepared to step in where someone else had failed. In business, opportunities rarely come neatly packaged, they often arrive disguised as someone else's oversight. The billionaire's sister was so used to being in control that she couldn't imagine anyone taking advantage of her mistakes. That blindness created openings so wide that someone with enough foresight and courage could walk right through without resistance. Each piece of information she gathered became part of a larger picture. She knew which projects were profitable, which ones were bleeding money, and which ones had potential but were left to wither. She understood the markets they were in, the customer complaints that were never addressed, and the competitors quietly gaining ground while the sister focused on keeping up appearances. It was like watching a fortress that looked impenetrable from the outside but had unlocked doors scattered along its walls. Her patience in studying these weaknesses wasn't about biding time aimlessly, it was about preparing herself to move with precision. She didn't want to simply take something for the sake of taking it, she wanted to choose the exact point of entry that would give her the greatest control and the least resistance. By the time she was ready, she knew the business landscape better than the woman who owned it. And when you understand something more deeply than the person in charge, you're not just spotting opportunity, you're positioning yourself to own it completely. Turning an insult into a business plan required a different kind of mindset, one that could take something meant to wound and reshape it into something that could build. The words useless could have easily settled into her thoughts as a truth if she had allowed them to. Instead, she treated them as raw material, something she could mold into a driving force. She understood that the most powerful revenge wasn't in throwing the insult back, it was in creating something so undeniable that the person who spoke it could never ignore her again. The moment the words were spoken, she began to reframe them, turning them over in her mind until they became less of a personal attack and more of a blueprint. The insult revealed more than the billionaire's sister realized. It showed what she valued, what she dismissed, and what she assumed was impossible for someone like her. That became the foundation of the plan. If she had been labeled useless because she didn't come from wealth or prestige, then the most effective way to dismantle that label was to succeed in a way that could not be attributed to privilege. The plan would have to prove her value in terms so clear that no one could claim it was an accident or a gift. It would have to be deliberate, calculated, and impossible to replicate without hard work and vision. She started by asking herself what would hurt her critic the most, not in a petty way, but in a way that would make the point undeniable. The answer was clear: take something the billionaire's sister cared about, something she had invested her pride in, and make it better. If the insult had been meant to exclude her from the world of influence and ownership, then the plan had to put her directly at the center of it. She wasn't going to simply join the table, she was going to own the table, the chairs, and the building it stood in. Every detail of the insult became a point of motivation. If useless meant she had no power, then she would build influence in ways the sister couldn't see coming. If useless meant she couldn't compete, then she would position herself in the exact same markets, but with a sharper understanding of what customers actually wanted. She began drafting outlines of ventures, projects, and acquisitions, each one designed not only to grow her own wealth but to touch areas of the billionaire sister's business indirectly. She didn't need to confront her head-on, she could work quietly, letting the results speak when the time was right. The business plan wasn't born out of emotion alone. She knew that relying only on anger would burn her out before she saw any results. So she paired her personal motivation with market research, studying industries that were both lucrative and aligned with her skills. She looked at where the billionaire's sister's ventures were underperforming and considered how she could enter those same spaces with stronger strategies. She mapped out potential partners, funding sources, and operational plans, making sure each piece was grounded in data and not just desire. One of the key steps in turning the insult into a plan was setting measurable goals. It wasn't enough to say she wanted to prove herself. She needed clear markers of progress, revenue targets, acquisition timelines, market share percentages. These numbers became her silent rebuttal to the insult, each one another piece of evidence that useless had never been accurate. She kept these goals private, sharing them only with a small circle of trusted allies who understood the bigger picture and could help her execute it. She also factored in the element of surprise. A direct challenge would have alerted the billionaire's sister and given her time to prepare. Instead, she planned for her moves to be gradual, subtle at first, and then suddenly undeniable. By the time her critic realized what was happening, it would already be too late to stop it. This required patience, but it also meant that every small win was part of a larger narrative she was building. The insult was no longer just a moment in her past, it was the first sentence of a story she was writing in real time. She found ways to integrate her personal strengths into the plan. Where the billionaire's sister relied heavily on branding and image, she leaned on authenticity and customer trust. Where the sister had connections through family name, she built hers through delivering consistent results. She understood that her so-called disadvantage, coming from outside the circles of privilege, was actually a competitive edge, allowing her to see things from the perspective of the people the sisters' businesses often overlooked. That perspective became part of her business model, giving her an advantage in areas where others struggled to connect. Each step forward was a silent conversation with that insult. Every deal closed, every project launched, every success achieved was another way of saying that the label had been wrong from the start. But she didn't need to say it out loud. The numbers, the influence, and the visible success would do it for her. The insult had been a spark, but the business plan was the fire, and she was the one controlling where it burned. Buying the startup to flip the power dynamic was never just about ownership, it was about rewriting the hierarchy that the billionaire's sister had used to define her worth. The idea had been simmering quietly in her mind long before the opportunity presented itself. She had studied the sisters' ventures carefully, noting which ones were thriving, which ones were struggling, and which ones had potential but were being squandered. Among them was a startup that had once been touted as the sisters' next big thing but had slowly faded from the spotlight. Publicly, it was framed as a pivot in business focus, but behind the scenes, it was clear the company was bleeding resources and being propped up more by image than actual performance. To most outsiders, the startup looked like a minor project, something too small to matter in the grand scheme of a billionaire's empire. That perception was exactly what made it valuable. She understood that in business, power wasn't just in the size of the asset but in what it represented. This particular startup had been tied closely to the sisters' personal branding, making it a symbol of her reach and influence. Taking control of it would not only give her a functional business to grow but would also chip away at the public image of her critic. When the chance came to buy it, she didn't rush in with visible enthusiasm. She approached it strategically, disguising her interest through intermediaries so that her name wasn't associated with the initial inquiries. This allowed her to negotiate without raising alarms, ensuring that the sister wouldn't see the deal as a personal challenge until it was too late to stop it. The due diligence process became a masterclass in patience and precision. She examined every detail of the company, its contracts, its debts, its customer base, and its operational structure. She wasn't just buying a name, she was buying a foundation she could rebuild into something stronger. The transaction itself was quiet. There were no press releases, no public celebrations, just a simple change in ownership paperwork. But beneath the surface, it was seismic. Overnight, she went from being someone dismissed as useless to the owner of a business that had once been a jewel in her rival's portfolio. The symbolism was as powerful as the reality. This was no longer a one-sided dynamic where the billionaire's sister held all the leverage. Now, she controlled a piece of the sisters' legacy, and that control shifted the balance between them. From the moment the deal was finalized, she began reimagining the startup's future. She replaced ineffective leadership, restructured departments, and refocused the brand on its core strengths. Where the sister had treated it as a side project, she treated it as a priority. Her hands-on approach quickly started to show results, customer satisfaction rose, partnerships were rekindled, and revenue began to climb. The transformation was not just operational, it was symbolic proof that the problem had never been the business idea itself, but the way it had been managed. Flipping the power dynamic wasn't about humiliating the sister in public, it was about demonstrating capability so clearly that the original insult lost its weight. Every improvement in the startup's performance was another quiet statement that she could take something discarded and turn it into something thriving. The more successful the company became under her leadership, the more it contrasted with its decline under the previous owner. People in the industry began to take notice, not because she demanded their attention, but because results spoke louder than any narrative her critic had once pushed. Owning the startup also gave her access to new circles of influence. Partners and clients who had once been loyal to the billionaire's sister began approaching her instead, drawn by the revival of the business and the fresh energy she brought to it. This expansion of her network strengthened her position far beyond the company itself, making her a player in spaces where she had previously been invisible. The power dynamic had shifted in a way that couldn't be undone, because now it wasn't based on opinion, it was based on tangible, documented achievement. The deal also carried a personal satisfaction that couldn't be measured in financial terms. She had taken something that symbolized her critics' success and made it her own, not through luck or charity, but through calculated strategy. It was a reminder that ownership changes the conversation. As long as the sister had been the one in control, the narrative had been fixed in her favor. But with the title in her own name, she dictated the terms, the direction, and the perception of the company. That was the essence of flipping the power dynamic, not just gaining control of an asset, but gaining control of the story surrounding it. She knew that the startup's success under her leadership would have ripple effects. Investors, clients, and industry insiders would remember who had once owned it and who had brought it back to life. Those comparisons would be drawn naturally, without her ever needing to say a word. The insult that had once been used to define her had now been buried under layers of proof, built on the very foundation of something the billionaire's sister had created but failed to sustain. Owning it meant more than holding the keys to a business, it meant holding the keys to a shift in respect, influence, and control that no one could take back. Redefining useless through success was not about proving something to a single person, it was about dismantling an entire perception that had been placed on her and, by extension, on others who looked like her or came from similar backgrounds. The word had been thrown at her with casual cruelty, meant to stick like a label she would carry forever. But instead of wearing it, she chose to strip it of its power and replace it with something entirely different. The transformation would not happen through arguments or rebuttals, it would happen through results so visible and undeniable that the insult would lose all meaning. Her first step was to decide what success meant on her own terms. It wasn't enough to make money or gain recognition, those things, while important, could be dismissed by others as luck or connections. She needed her success to be rooted in competence, vision, and sustained achievement. That meant building something that not only thrived but also created opportunities for others, something that could not be easily diminished or explained away. She wanted to redefine herself in a way that wasn't temporary but permanent, so that the word useless would never again fit, not for her and not for anyone like her. The process began with consistent, disciplined work. Every day was a step toward the version of herself that the insult claimed she could never be. She learned, adapted, and refused to be distracted by noise or negativity. She invested in her skills, took calculated risks, and made decisions based on long-term goals rather than short-term validation. Slowly, the evidence of her competence began to build. Small wins turned into bigger ones, and each milestone became another layer in the wall she was constructing between her identity and the label she had been given. Redefinition also meant visibility. She understood that in order to erase the narrative of useless, her success had to be seen. That didn't mean chasing attention for its own sake, It meant letting her results speak in places where they could not be ignored. She accepted speaking engagements, appeared at industry events, and made sure her projects were presented with clarity and confidence. The goal was not to boast, but to make it impossible for anyone to pretend she hadn't achieved what she had. Her achievements began to ripple outward. People who had once underestimated her started to shift their tone, speaking of her with respect, sometimes grudgingly at first. Others who had never met her but had heard the old narrative now had to reconcile it with the reality of her accomplishments. This shift in perception wasn't just about her, it became a challenge to the stereotype itself. If someone they had once written off as useless could do what she had done, then perhaps the label had never been accurate for anyone. She made a deliberate choice to use her platform to create opportunities for others, knowing that the most powerful way to destroy a label is not just to prove it wrong for yourself, but to open the door for others to do the same. She invested in mentoring, supported small businesses, and partnered with individuals who had been overlooked. In doing so, she created a living example that the term useless was rooted in bias, not truth. Every person who succeeded through these opportunities became part of the broader redefinition she was building. As her influence grew, the contrast between the insult and the reality became starker. The billionaire's sister, who had once spoken the words so easily, now found herself in a world where that narrative no longer held power. Industry peers who had been present for the original insult had witnessed the transformation firsthand. They had seen her take the word meant to diminish her and turn it into the foundation of her rise. Each new success made the insult seem smaller, weaker, and more obviously false. Redefining herself in this way required constant forward momentum. She knew she could not rest on a single victory. The narrative shift had to be reinforced over and over until it was unshakable. She continued to innovate, expand her ventures, and set higher goals. Every time she reached one, it became another piece of evidence in the case she was building against the label. This was not about one grand moment of vindication, but about a steady, undeniable accumulation of proof that could not be argued away. What had once been a word meant to limit her had now become a catalyst for limitless ambition. In redefining useless, she had not only changed how others saw her, she had changed how she saw herself. The insult no longer carried any sting, it had been replaced by an identity she had built with her own hands, one that stood on the strength of her vision, her persistence, and her results. Every step forward was a reminder that success is the most powerful form of redefinition, and that the truest revenge is not in proving someone else wrong, but in living in a way that makes their words irrelevant.